Now, this second lecture I've called Eastern Christianity, the Oriental Orthodox. The first lecture I called the Eastern Orthodox. There's a sort of a bit of a problem here about naming things, but the Eastern Orthodox are those who come out of the Byzantine tradition. That is the Greek Church, the Bulgarian Church, the Romanian Church, the Russian Church, and so on. So we call those the Eastern Orthodox. And then we have this other group called the Oriental Orthodox, and these refer to these other churches. Like the Copts and the Syrians and Armenians and so on. And these are the ones that I want to talk to you about in this lecture. So let's just again remind ourselves of this geography. This was what we had in the middle of the 6th century under Justinian's empire, this first Byzantine Commonwealth. We have all of this territory in the east and North Africa, which is by the middle of the 6th century largely Christian. There are still pockets of Manichaeans and Gnostics and a few pagans and so on. It's not all Christianity by any means, but it's dominantly Christian. But by the middle of the 6th century under Justinian, we have these divisions in the church. So we have these Copts in Egypt, Syrians in Palestine and Syria, Armenians and Georgians in the Caucasus and so on. This is the sort of picture. I told you it's a sort of multicultural, multilinguistic environment. And then we had these Arab conquests in the middle of the 7th century, which changed the political, but not necessarily immediately the religious situation. Sometimes the Arab invasions are presented to you in your history books as if the Arabs sweep into this area, they slaughter every Christian in sight, and everything is Islamic, everything overnight is Muslim. Forget it, it's just not like that. It takes several hundred years for the majority Christian to change to a majority of Muslim. Several hundred years. So what this means is that Arabs, to begin with, in the early established caliphate, are having to engage with all sorts of different people from different religions, basically Christians of different traditions in the caliphate. So it's not an overnight success. It's not an overnight conversion. It didn't happen like that. Christians were treated as people of the book, because in the Qur'an there are people mentioned as the people of the book. Who are the people of the book? Well, basically they're those who have a written scripture. So Jews and Christians, to begin with, have a written tradition, a written scripture, and they're recognized within the Quran as having a place within an Islamic empire. They have a place. They have the right to practice their religion, right? It's there, it's a Quranic injunction for that to happen. Because Islam sees itself as a successor on the one hand to the Jewish tradition and on the other to the Christian tradition. And it recognizes Jewish prophets, it recognizes Jesus as a prophet, it recognizes John the Baptist as a prophet, it recognizes Jesus' mother, Mary, as a great woman. It's all there, you can read it in the Quran. So Islam looks at the past monotheistic traditions of Christianity and Judaism and sees itself very much in a line, in a linear development, right? So that's how it was looked at in the early Islamic world and was understood. Again, these Arab conquests and the emergence of this caliphate. The caliphate is what we call the name. The caliph is the administrator. He's very much like the Byzantine emperor. Do you remember I said the Byzantine emperor sees himself very much closely aligned with the church and with the patriarch? Church and state rule together in Byzantium. And what we get in the early caliphate is a theocratic state. So the caliph sees himself very much as the representative of the prophet, because there's a great debate in early Islam about who succeeds the prophet, who succeeds as the leader of the community. Not as a prophet, but as a successor, as a leader of the emerging Muslim community. All right? So this is rather important that the caliph takes on this role in the first sort of few hundred years of Arab rule. And I mentioned that the Umayyad Caliphate is based at Damascus through to 750. There's a revolution about 750 in Damascus, and the whole emphasis of the early Arab Caliphate shifts to the east, to Baghdad. So that from the middle of the 8th century, Baghdad becomes the center of the Arab Islamic Empire. To begin with, it's based at Damascus, then it shifts to Baghdad. And Baghdad becomes the center of the Muslim world from this period of the middle of the 8th century, at least through to the middle of the 12th century. Strong and important history. Jerusalem. Jerusalem in the early Islamic world is very important. And I'm sure when you look at this photograph, you'll recognize what it is. So what you've got basically are the remains of the Second Temple. And on the Second Temple Mount are two buildings, two Muslim buildings, two Islamic buildings. To the right is the Dome of the Rock, and in the middle is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And both of these are early Islamic Muslim Arab buildings, very important. To the left, I don't know whether can point it out here. Yes, I can. Can you see where I'm going here? I'm sure you know what that is. This is the Holy Sepulchre. When you go as a Christian pilgrimage, on a pilgrimage as a Christian to Jerusalem, you go and visit the Holy Sepulchre. And the Holy Sepulchre, before the late 7th century, was the dominant building in Jerusalem. The Jews were never allowed to rebuild the temple under the Christian emperors. Never allowed to rebuild it. The Holy Sepulchre, the Christians dominated the cityscape of Jerusalem. If you look at these two photographs, they're very interesting. Take the one on the right here. In the bottom of this right slide, this is the dome of the Holy Sepulchre. Can you see it there? I'm sure some of you have visited it. Look at it in relationship to the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount. In other words, this building of the Holy Sepulchre was the dominant Christian building in Jerusalem up until the late 7th century, when the Arabs built the Dome of the Rock on top of the Second Temple area in that holy space there. From the late 7th century then, the Dome of the Rock becomes the dominant building in Jerusalem. And it's showing you about continuity, if you like, because one is showing you this is where the temple of the Jews were, this is where the Christian Holy Sepulchre is. Then come along the Arabs and they build this building, the Dome of the Rock, right on top of the Temple Mount. There it is. It was built in 695. And what you see today is more or less what that building was in the late 7th century. It's an extremely important building because it's the earliest Arab Muslim building that has survived. There's nothing in Arabia that's as early as this. There is a shrine and possibly a mosque associated with the Prophet Muhammad, but this is the most important building. Who built this building? The Arabs had no tradition of building monuments like this. So the obvious question is, who built it? Who could build buildings like this in the late 7th century? Yes, exactly. It was built by Christians. Now there's some irony here, isn't there? Because this Dome of the Rock is built on a place that's sacred to Jews. Maybe some of you visited it, but it's over a cave. It's over a particular thing called the Rock, the cave. Here you can see the interior of the Dome of the Rock. It's a fantastic building. And it's got a central dome. It's like a church. It's a Byzantine building. Inside it's full of mosaics. Who did the mosaics? Well, there were craftsmen and workers who were sent from Constantinople to do it. Who designed it? Who built it? Christians. Arabs had no tradition of building like this. So basically it is a Christian Byzantine building built for the Arabs to celebrate a particular event in the Qur'an. Well, according to Islamic tradition, this is the place where the Prophet Muhammad ascended into heaven. And there's an event in the Qur'an where he ascends on his horse into heaven. But of course it's also associated in the Jewish tradition, this spot as well, with the sacrifice of Isaac. So none of this is accidental. All of this is deliberate. The Arabs know exactly what they were doing. They were appropriating a holy spot and doing it because they associated with this spot, or came to associate this spot, with the ascension of the Prophet Muhammad. And it's the dominant building in Jerusalem. So you've had your Jewish temple, you've had your Christian era with your Holy Sepulchre, now you've got your Islamic era with the Dome of the Rock. This is why it is so important, this building. And perhaps often why it's not explained to people why it is so important. We hear about what happens in Jerusalem with Jews at the Wailing Wall, and often the Jewish authorities try to stop the Muslims and others from coming to venerate the Dome of the Rock. Dome of the Rock, by the way, is not a mosque, it's a shrine. The Al-Aqsa Mosque from the early 8th century is a mosque. This isn't, it's a shrine. You can see perhaps why it's important. But if you look at some of the mosaics in the Dome of the Rock, remember it's built in the late 7th century. This is what you can see. On the left is a wonderful bit of mosaic work, and it shows you a Byzantine diadem. And do you remember I showed you Theodora? You probably didn't see the close-up. Look at it. What's it telling us? And if I go to this one, this is also in the Dome of the Rock on the left, and there's a Persian coin. Now, if this isn't good use of propaganda, I don't know what is. Because it's telling us quite clearly, I think, isn't it? You know, what is the Arabs have taken over the Byzantine world? Here's your evidence. Look, we're the guys on top here. Forget the Byzantines, and also forget the Sasanian Persians. We've taken over. We're the top dog now. And it's one of the things that the Dome of the Rock does. It not only celebrates the presence of Islam, but it also there's propaganda built into the mosaic program inside this building. It has so much to tell us that we probably don't really understand, but there's a few ideas. The Dome of the Rock was built by the Caliph al-Malik, right? And it's very interesting to look at his coins. Because again, the Arabs had no tradition of minting coins, as they had no tradition of building monuments. So what do? You suddenly got all of this great territory which belonged to the Byzantine Empire. You've got to control it. You've got to have trade. You've got to continue to trade with your Byzantine neighbours, or your Persian neighbours, or your Egyptian neighbours. You've got to do something, haven't you? Else the whole thing is going to collapse. And good colonial powers don't let it collapse. They use what's there to develop their things, their ideas. At the top is a coin of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian II, minted in 692. Underneath it is a coin minted 1 year later by al-Malik. Look at it. He's using the same sort of ideas that he's taking from the Byzantine coin, but he's doing something very interesting to it, isn't he? There are no human figures on his coin. He's imitating that coinage because he needs to deal in trade with the Byzantines. But he's not going to put Christ on his coin, is he? Justinian II has, showing quite clearly he's a Christian emperor. But al-Malik, as a caliph, he's not going to put Christ on his coins. There's a great crisis that's happening in the monetary development at this point. But this is what he's doing. And a little bit later, in 696, he comes up with this. Completely what we call aniconic coinage. That is, he's only got inscription on it. And from then on, the Arab world uses this sort of coinage in which there's an inscription in Arabic. But you can see what's happening. It's developing. There's a process of development that's happening at this point. In Damascus, if you go to the Great Mosque, which this one is erected in 715, so it's early 8th century, what was here before they built this? A Christian church, the Great Church, which was built on top of a Roman temple. Okay? So we had a Roman temple, a Hellenistic Roman temple. Christians come along, knock it down, build their church. Later on, the Arabs come along. They don't knock the church down, not a bit of it. They reorganize the church into a mosque. And to begin with, certainly in the 8th and 9th centuries, this was a place of shared worship by Christians and Muslims. The Muslims turned up on a Friday, the Christians turned up on Sunday. And they used the same space. This church was dedicated to John the Baptist. And do you remember I said John the Baptist is recognized as a prophet within the Qur'an and within the Islamic tradition? If you go in the great mosque in Damascus, unfortunately you can't at the moment because the political situation doesn't allow it, but it's a very interesting building, like the Dome of the Rock here, because on the left, further down on the left here, in what is a mosque today, is the relics of John the Baptist. Because that's what it was. It was a church dedicated to John the Baptist. His relics were there. It was then taken over by the Arabs and used as a mosque. It's fully used as a mosque today, but it's still the relics of John the Baptist are venerated by Muslims in this mosque. Very interesting. This is what's happening in the early Islamic world. It's a very fluid situation. It's a situation where Christians and Jews and Muslims are talking to each other in a way that they haven't talked to each other since, unfortunately. But that's a fact of history. Let's look at the Qur'an very quickly. Just one quotation from a surah. Say to the people of the book. Who are the people of the book? The people of the book are those who have scriptures. Jews and Christians mainly. Let us agree upon one matter which is the same for you and for us. And it's addressed to Christians, this particular passage. Namely, that we worship none but Allah, and that we associate no partner with him, and that some of us take no others for lords besides Allah. This is, into the Quran is built a polemic. And that polemic is directed against people of the book. People of the book are accepted within the Islamic worldview and have a place there. But it doesn't mean to say that the Quran is not argumentative or engaging in a polemic with Jews and Christians, because it does. So this is aimed at Christians. They're called associators in Arabic because they associate more than two people, or have two people associated, or two persons with God. Because there's a Trinitarian tradition, isn't there, within Christian theology and theologizing, right? But from a Muslim point of view, from a strictly Muslim monotheistic point of view, there can only be God. You can't associate a Son or a Holy Spirit with that God. This is why Christians are called associators in the Quran. And it's part of an ongoing polemic that's happening at this point. Here's another one just from the 9th century, not from the Quran, but from an early Muslim writer. You revere the cross and the icon. You kiss them and prostrate before them, but they are man-made things which cannot hear or see. You think the greatest of them are made of gold and silver, just as the people of Abraham did with their images and idols. But the Prophet commanded us to worship God alone, not to associate anything with him, not to make any god with him, not to worship a cross or an icon. Actually, it doesn't say that in the Quran. It doesn't say, thou shalt not venerate an icon or a cross or whatever. But there's an ongoing polemic here, all right? And that is the polemic that's going on with Christians and to some extent with Jews in this early period, 8th, 9th, 10th century. There's a great debate that goes on between the three monotheistic traditions. And it wasn't unusual for the Caliph in Baghdad to bring in Christian intellectuals, Jewish intellectuals, and Muslim intellectuals and say, right, here's your topic for the day, debate it. And let's see who can win. That happened in Baghdad. It happened under the Caliphate in places like Cordova in southern Spain. We have records of these debates between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. It's fantastic. It's fantastic stuff. Because it shows you that they wanted to learn from each other, wanted to know about each other. And as I say, we've had less and less of that from at least the 12th, 11th, 12th century. We've all gone our separate ways, and nobody really talks to each other. It wasn't like that in the early Arab period. It was a cosmopolitan period, a period of intellectual stimulation and development. And if you look at this little diagram here, it's to do with the transmission of classical thought into the Arab world. In the Eastern Christian world, there was a synthesis between Greek thought and Christian theology, well developed by the early church fathers through to about the 8th century. And then this classical learning is transmitted to the Arabs. Don't think of the Arabs, that they didn't want to know anything. They didn't come from an intellectual environment. But once they put down roots and became civilized people, taking over great cities like Damascus, Jerusalem, and so on, they became settled communities, and they were interested in the intellectual history of the Near East. And so in Baghdad, in the 9th century, there was a great translation movement of translating works from Greek into Arabic. So Aristotle, Plato, all of these great masters of the ancient world were translated into Arabic. Because early Arab intellectuals couldn't get enough of this. They thought it was fantastic stuff. Just as Christians earlier on had thought this was very interesting and sort of developed a synthesis with this. So the Arabs did this to begin with as well, particularly in the 9th and 10th centuries. But who were the middlemen in this transmission of learning? They were Christians. So the Christians acted as translators, translating works from Greek into Syriac, Syriac into Arabic, or straight from Greek into Arabic, whatever you wanted. They could do it. These were the people who did it. So the Christians in Baghdad acted as the middlemen in transmitting this ancient learning to the Arabs. The Arabs then did their own thing with it and ran with it. Right? And the way that classical learning came back to the West in the 12th century, because I think we were talking in the break, somebody was talking about the Dark Ages, which of course we don't use that expression anymore, it doesn't really exist. It does in the old history books, but it's not like that. But certainly there was a need for intellectual stimulation amongst theologians and so on in the West, in Paris, in Oxford by the 12th century. And the way that this Arab translation movement came to the West was through Spain. Do you remember, if you go back and look at your map and you see the early Arab Caliphate, it incorporates southern Spain. So if you go to Cordova, for example, in the 9th century, it was a great center of intellectual activity. Particularly in the 11th century, all of this translation into Arabic was moving through North Africa, through the early Arab world, Islamic world, into southern Spain, where it was then translated, mainly by Jewish translators, into Latin, and subsequently found its way into Paris, Oxford, all the great universities. So Thomas Aquinas, for example, in the 13th century, could not have done his theology in the 13th century without all of this understanding of Aristotle. And who did he get it from? He got it from the Arabs. And who did the Arabs get it from? They got it from the Eastern Christians and so on. It's a remarkable sort of event in Western intellectual history that's often forgotten. That there could not have been a scholasticism, there could not have been the emergence of an intellectual tradition in the 13th century in the West without the Arabs. So we owe a lot to the Arabs in the Western tradition. Okay, this is just a footnote, but it's a very important footnote. It got lost in the translation, by the way. All right, so if you translate something from Greek into Syriac, into Arabic, and then you translate it into Latin, you can probably guess what you got at the end of the day. So what Thomas Aquinas understood about Aristotle in the 13th century is not what we understand about Aristotle today. It's quite different, because it's not until the modern period, early modern period, that we get the text as Aristotle wrote them and Plato and so on. Never mind, doesn't matter. It's what stimulated things at that point. Here you've got a diagram. So you've got Greek, Byzantium, Constantinople, translated Syriac in the Near East, already by the 6th century through to this period, the Arabic in Baghdad, through to Andalusia in southern Spain, into Latin and so on. And it is Christian monotheists, Jewish monotheists, Muslim monotheists, all engaged in this translation movement, talking to each other and so on, writing books about each other and so on. It's a stimulating period of intellectual activity between the three monotheistic traditions. Let's go back to our Oriental Orthodox. Okay, this is who they are generally. So we have, up until the Council of Chalcedon, the ecumenical councils, the first three ecumenical councils then, are accepted by the Coptic Orthodox, the Syrian Orthodox, the Armenian Orthodox, and the Ethiopian Orthodox. These are the main Oriental Orthodox churches. They accept the first three councils. That is, they don't accept Chalcedon. Chalcedon is the turning point, divides off the Eastern churches. But there is another church called the so-called Nestorian Church, which I want to say more about, accepts the first two ecumenical councils, that is, it doesn't accept Ephesus and those subsequently onwards, all right? Its correct name is the Church of the East, not the Nestorian Church. It's the Church of the East is its correct name. Let's see if we can say some more. These Oriental Orthodox, and I'm talking mostly about the Syrians, the Copts and the Armenians, since the crusading period and medieval period, many of these have had Eastern Catholic uniate counterparts, as they're called, such as the Armenian Catholic Church, there's a Coptic Catholic Church and so on. And since 1445, the Church of the East, that is the so-called Nestorian Church, has had a Catholic counterpart called the Chaldean Church. The Maronite Church that you've probably heard about, which is, I must say that in Australia, by the way, we have every representative of all these Eastern churches. There are large communities of Copts in in Sydney and in Melbourne. We have Church of the East in Melbourne and in Sydney. All of these are represented as diaspora communities in Australia, and very strong groups too. The Maronite Church is also represented, but the Maronite Church is very interesting because it doesn't have an Orthodox counterpart. It's entirely Latin Catholic now. Wasn't the case originally. It was a Syriac-speaking church in the Lebanon. It's still there today. Still uses Syriac and Arabic in its liturgy and so on, but it comes totally under Rome. All right? It doesn't have an Orthodox counterpart like all the others do. It gets rather complicated, and I'm not going to go too complicated for you. Since the 19th century, many of these Oriental Orthodox churches have also had Protestant counterparts as well. So there's a Coptic Protestant church, all right? And an Armenian Protestant church as well. Okay, I think that's complicated enough because it gets even more complicated, but this is just to show you what's happened historically. What about this Nestorian church? I'm sure you've all heard at some point about the Nestorian Church. It's a misnomer. It doesn't exist. There was never a Nestorian Church. It's called the Church of the East. That's the title it was known by. That's the title that it calls itself today. Sometimes it calls itself the Assyrian Church of the East, but the Church of the East will do. Okay? Now, there were Christians in Persia by at least the 3rd century. Aramaic or Syriac speakers. You have to remember that in the early Christian period there were 3 great Christian languages. You know 2 of them, but you probably forget what the third is. The third is Syriac. What is Syriac? Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic. And we all know who spoke Aramaic, don't we? But probably what you don't know is there's a vast literature in Syriac. We all know about the Greek writings of the fathers, the Latin writings. There's a huge corpus of writings in Syriac, of the Syriac fathers. Huge corpus that hardly any of us as Westerners know about, but it's there. Anyway, these Christians in Persia, these Eastern Christians in the 3rd century, were probably Syriac speakers or Aramaic speakers living in the Sasanian Persian Empire. There were severe persecutions during the 4th century. We have records. Martyrs of the church in Persia from this period, 4th and 5th centuries. Now the Church of the East, which lived and was situated in Persian territory, declared its independence in 424. That is before the Council of Ephesus, which happened in 435. And in 435, the Bishop of Constantinople, Nestorius, was condemned, and he was sent into exile. And he spent 17 years in exile in Egypt, where he died. But he was anathematized, he was condemned. Nestorius never founded a church of his own, and I'm sure he would have been horrified to think historically that he was told that he did, because his name became associated with this church. But it's all bunkum. It's all historical bunkum, I'm afraid. He never founded a church of his own. The Church of the East followed what is called the Antiochene, that is the tradition of Antioch, right? To which Nestorius belonged. Nestorius came from Antioch, he was made Bishop of Constantinople. Like John Chrysostom, he came from Antioch to Constantinople. Right? And he's a father in the Church of the East, because the Church of the East owes its allegiance, its theology, to the school of Antioch. right? And he's a father and a saint in that church. But he never founded a church of his own. There's no such thing called a Nestorian church. So how did it come about that this travesty of something called the Nestorian church? It's a very good example about how church history is written up, okay? Because what happened is that from the Byzantine and the Latin side of it, they condemned Nestorius at the Council of Ephesus. Nestorius at that council was opposed by Cyril of Alexandria, and Cyril's theology triumphed in the church at the Council of Ephesus. So Nestorius and the school of Antioch was booted out. So it's the school of Alexandria which was triumphant in the theology of the church. It's what you all have today. We're all good so-called Diophysites. You knew that, didn't you? You knew you were a good Diophysite, didn't you? You are. Because that's the tradition that's accepted, all right? But Nestorius, because he was condemned at Ephesus, is then treated as a heretic. And all those Syriac-speaking Christians who don't live under the Byzantine emperor, who live in that foreign eastern world of the Persians, forget them. They're all heretics. They're all Nestorians. It's a total travesty. But that's what they did. That's how they wrote church history. And you can still read church history books today, and that's what it'll be presented to you. Nestorius was a heretic in the church in the 5th century, founded a church called Nestorianism, but these are terrible heretics that somehow are beyond the pale and the rest of it. It won't wash, and it's wrong. Okay? There was never a Nestorian church. What there was a church of the East. It found itself living under an alien Zoroastrian tradition in Sasanian Persia, yes, right? And it declared its, well, wouldn't you, 424, declare your autonomy for your church? How are you going to manage? You're seen to be an enemy, right, within the Persian tradition. You're a Christian. You're a minority, okay? You've been persecuted. You've got to have some sort of dialogue with the authorities. One way that the church saw that it could maintain its identity and its continuity was to declare its independence, which is what it did. Okay? It was then not seen by the Persian Zoroastrian authorities as being the enemy within, the fifth columnist or whatever. It didn't owe allegiance to the Byzantines, you see, or the Roman Empire. It's good politics. It's what you would do, isn't it? You've got to look after your own community and survive. That's what happened. And it's that tradition that we're going to have to talk about in the third lecture later on, because I want to talk about the transmission of Christianity to the East into China, Central Asia, and India. And it's largely this Persian Christianity that we find there. This is just to say something about Nestorius. He got knocked on the head because he wouldn't accept that the Mary should be called the Mother of God, the Theotokos. But he also said, if you look at the little bit that I've given you at the bottom, he said, that's okay, you can have it, you can use that title. I'm happy with that, right? But for goodness sake, don't turn the Virgin into a goddess. And for this he was condemned by Cyril of Alexandria in particular, and made sure that Nestorius and the Antiochene tradition, as understood at that time in the 5th century by Nestorius, was not to be the dominant theology of the church. Right? And that's been the situation right through from the 5th century, and we're still our legacy today. Okay, let's go to one or two places where we find this Oriental Orthodox tradition. In Egypt, for example, the Coptic church, the Coptic is an early Christian language, really gets going by about the late 3rd century, from the 4th century, 5th century. Lots of writings started to appear in Coptic. It becomes the indigenous language of the native Christians of Egypt, all right? Greek is continued, as Cyril of Alexandria was patriarch of the church in Alexandria. For example, in the 5th century, he wrote everything in Greek. But alongside this Greek is a native indigenous writing called Coptic. The White Monastery in Upper Egypt is a famous monastery. Of course, Egypt is the cradle of Christian monasticism, still is very much today. If you go to Egypt, unfortunately it's very difficult to go at the moment, but there are many very important early monastic settlements that you can still see. This is one of them. It's called the White Monastery. It was founded by Shenouda, a great Coptic writer in the early 5th century. He founded this monastery. There are many of these monasteries, and it's a living tradition within Eastern Christianity, monasticism, by the way. Monasticism has always been part of Eastern Christianity from the very beginning. There's never been a point in its history, either for the Byzantine Eastern Orthodox or the Oriental Orthodox, in which monasticism has not played a role. And monastics have often held on to traditions in difficult times. I've said to you that under Islam, Christians have the right to practice their religion. Of course, it's enshrined in the Qur'an, but in practice, it may be very different. And of course, we have many Christian martyrs under the Arabs and later on under the Ottomans as well. Christians who refused to really bow and convert to Islam and so on. So there are times of persecution. Don't get me wrong. Don't misread the history here. Although Christians have that right to practice, there are times of persecution. And what has happened traditionally in those periods of persecution is that the monastics have held on to the tradition very much. And so monasticism is seen as a foundation in Eastern Christianity, going back into this early period, at least the 4th century. And as I say, many of your hierarchs within the Coptic church or the Byzantine church come from the monastic tradition. So it's an unmarried hierarchy within the church as bishops, patriarchs, metropolitans and so on. They come from that monastic tradition. And it feeds into the Christian tradition in Eastern Christianity. It's very difficult to conceive of Eastern Christianity without its monastic tradition. It is a patristic tradition. That is, you go back to theologize through your fathers, right? Whether it's your Coptic fathers, your Armenian fathers, your Greek fathers, or whatever. Right? So you have to think about this as a sort of post-Reformation type of Christianity in which patristics and learning from your tradition is very much how you theologize, right? You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You revisit it, right? So patristic tradition is a dynamic. This is what you have to try to understand about how do you understand tradition in the East. It's not dead. You don't think of tradition as being a dead thing. Wasn't it Henry Ford, or who was the famous person who said, history is bunkum, or whatever I can't remember. Was it Henry Ford? I think it might have been. Forget it. Tradition is a living thing, all right? And it has a dynamic. And you have to understand how that dynamic works and how you engage with that dynamic. And issues that concern us as contemporary Christians, what do? You go back and you look to see, well, let's see what, I don't know, this particular father might have to say about this issue. Obviously, there are issues that are not discussed within the tradition. But that doesn't mean that you don't find a way to talk about that issue within that tradition. And this is what you do. This is how you theologize in an Eastern Christian context. You have to go back, you have to look, you have to negotiate it in a dynamic that's seen as a living tradition, right? It's understanding, it's going back to look at the past in order to understand the present, in order to move into the future. That's how you should think of it. But of course, for most of us coming from a Western tradition, particularly from a post sort of Reformation tradition, we don't understand how that notion of tradition works anymore. But I think it's something we need to consider, all of us, from whatever tradition we come from. What do we do with this great richness of writings of the fathers of the church? I mean, they weren't just sort of wasting the time and got nothing else to do but write theology. These guys were in the middle of the politics of the time. They often ended up in prison. They're often exiled, condemned by church councils, and then subsequently found out, well, actually, Maximus the Confessor turned out to be right after all, you know? We can't always get it right, and so you have to go back and revisit it. And so the notion of tradition as a living dynamic is like liturgy. The liturgy is central to Eastern Christianity. Understanding your identity is through your liturgy, right? And liturgy is not a dead thing. right? You're not practicing something because you think that's what they did 2,000 years ago, because nothing stands still, does it? Nothing that human beings do as institutions, liturgies and so on, they develop, they change over time, as everybody recognizes, as the fathers of the church recognized, that there's a development in liturgy, doctrine and so on. There's nothing new about this. It's ancient and it's part of it. Look at this white monastery. It's very interesting when you have a look at this doorway. Can you see, I hope you can see, but on the left, I don't know whether you can see this, but there's some hieroglyphics here. Can you see? There are hieroglyphics. These are dismantled from the old pharaonic temples and have been reused in the doorways of the white monastery here. On the right you can see we've got crosses over the doorway. This gives you an idea about continuity in the early Christian and the medieval period. Some of us have this rather simplistic idea that somehow Christianity comes in, just like Islam comes in, all the Christianity disappears, everybody becomes a Muslim overnight. It's the same with the early Christianity. Somehow overnight we all become Christians, all the pagans disappear off the screen. It's just not like that. It takes time for these things to develop. And using and utilizing pagan temple material into your church is what you did, right? You didn't disown it because somebody else had owned it once. Not a bit of it. You utilized it. Just as you utilized the intellectual tradition, which is what happened in early Christianity, you utilize your building material and so on. You take it over and do it. And when Muslims come along, what do? Often they don't destroy the church, they convert that church into a mosque. Right? There's this sort of notion that if something is useful or something has a sort of notion perhaps of holiness, you know, that it should be used. There's some way of utilizing it in some way. You don't knock everything down and start again, right? It's not like that. You utilize what you can. This is the Red Monastery near the White Monastery in Upper Egypt. Fantastic iconography in the church here that you can see, decorated very nicely. In the Coptic tradition, there are use of icons as in the Byzantine tradition. Not so heavily the emphasis on icons and iconography in these Oriental Orthodox traditions as in the Byzantine tradition. But nevertheless, they're not iconoclastic either. That's the point I would like to make. And if you go down into the Oasis area in southern Upper Egypt, you come across some early settlements like this huge cemetery area at Bagawat in the Kharga Oasis. You're looking at basically 6th and 5th century buildings, which are hardly known to us from a Western perspective. A huge necropolis of Christian buildings. And if this doesn't show you the extent of the Christian communities living in these oasis areas 1,500 years ago, then, you know, I don't know what does. This is great evidence for it. And we forget that on these sort of peripheries of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, were strong Christian communities living in quite remote areas who left these magnificent sort of mud brick buildings, which have survived right through to till today. And just very quickly, I'm going to stop, give me 5 more minutes, and we're going to just go to Armenia. This is the area of Armenia and Georgia in the Caucasus area. Georgia and Armenia, as I say, have been Christian from at least the late 4th century and the early 5th century when they acquired an alphabet with their Christianization. Armenia is a very interesting area because it has lots of early churches dating back some to about the 6th and 7th century. On the left here, the capital of the Catholicos, he's the head of the Armenian church. He resides at Echmiadzin, which is the center of the church in what is now the Republic of Armenia. And on the right, at Lake Sevan, you can see an early monastic settlement dating back to the 6th century with some 7th century churches and so on. I just want to show you 1 or 2 things here from the 7th century. The reason I want to show you these is because I talked to you about the Dome of the Rock. Do you remember? And we said, who built the Dome of the Rock? These guys built it. The best architects in the 7th century were the Armenians. You're looking at 2 7th century churches. Where could you find a church like that from the 7th century in the West? You can't. These are the guys who are building their churches, right? I mean, the one on the right, forget the bell tower on the front there. Just think about that with its central dome and its east-west orientation and so on, its blind arcading. These are 7th century churches being built in Armenia. These are the top dogs when it comes to church architecture in the 7th century. Look at this, a fantastic rotunda on a huge scale. We're used to thinking of rotundas as being a sort of modern church thing. Forget it. This is a 7th century church, a huge rotunda church on a huge scale. Unfortunately, it was mostly destroyed in the 9th century with an earthquake, because Armenia is a seismic area with earthquakes and so on. It's trying to sort of engage you with this long tradition of, in this instance, church building and its influence in the East. And it was Armenian architects who designed the Dome of the Rock, and it was Byzantine mosaicists who came and decorated it, right? So it shows the interconnectedness between Christianity, Eastern Christianity, early Islam, but of these wonderful Armenian churches. If you go up into the mountains, you can see them. And a wonderful tradition of what are called hatch cars, right? These are beautiful decorated, some are tombstones, some are marker stones or boundary stones with wonderful crosses on them. The cross is a very dominant piece of iconography in Armenian Christianity. But they're absolutely fantastic, as you can see. Dating back perhaps to about the 8th and 9th century, some of the earliest ones. But it echoes something for me, I don't know about you. Think about another Western tradition with all of this sort of beautiful decorated crosses and designs. I'm sure you can. Yes, yes. Look at these, they're fantastic. And these as well. Dating perhaps about the 9th or 10th century. Okay, Lindisfarne Gospels. Celtic art, you can think about all of that. There are only 2 places where the tradition of building high crosses, of decorated crosses in the early, early medieval period that we find it. One right out on the extreme east of Christendom in Armenia, and the other in the western extreme in the Celtic world. I find this fascinating. These two, what's the connection? I don't know. I don't know. Some scholars have tried to, well, somebody once described that they'd found some Armenian names in an Irish monastery dating back to about the 7th or 8th centuries. I don't know. I haven't seen the evidence for that. But I do find it interesting that both ends of Christendom we have this tradition of decorated crosses there. Okay, I'll stop.